Okay, this is the video that starts this course, Spatial Simulation and Modeling in GIS. And in the first chapter of this course, we're going to talk about spatial simulation models. What are they? Why are we using them? And how to use them? Okay. In this chapter, I'm going to introduce basic concepts um, about models and more specifically simulation models. Okay. So what is a model or what is a scientific model? According to the textbook, a model is a simplified representation of a real-world system that can be used to explore, to understand, to predict the behavior of the system it represents. Okay, so keywords here, simplified representation. It means that a model cannot address every aspect of the real world system you're interested in. It's a simplified representation, which means that a model should address the part of the system or parts of the system that you are interested in instead of the whole system, okay? It means that a model is not perfect and it should not be perfect. It's not necessary in most scenarios. What's the purpose of a model? You use a model to explore the system, to understand the system, or when you are using this model to address the relationship between different components of a system, you can use this model to predict the state of the system in future. Okay, that's the purpose of a model. So simplified representation, keep the essential features of the system or the features you are interested in. Ignore the irrelevant or not very important details. Like I said, in most scenarios, it's not necessary to address all aspects, all details from of the real world system, And the goal is the knowledge about the real world to explore, to understand, to predict. Here is an example of GIS model. On the left side, we have a picture of real world. It's a very busy block from Japan because we can see Japanese here, right, on the building. And it looks like a combination of business buildings and residential buildings. Here is a huge building, looks like a office building or business building, and we have other houses. They look like residential buildings, okay? So if we're interested in this block, we can make abstraction of this block or model, right? Models. So in this model on the right side, we have different 3D models, or you can say 3D boxes, each box representing a specific building in this block. Obviously, on the right side, this model is a simplification of the real world. And we can use this model to learn knowledge about the real world, for example, through spatial analysis or other research methods you find useful. You can use them on this model of the real world of this block to learn, to explore, to learn, and maybe to predict. So that's an example. And then there are different types of models. There are conceptual models, physical models, mathematical models, empirical models, and simulation models, which are the models we care in this course. I'm going to go through the concepts of them and also some examples very quickly in this chapter, because like I said, this is a starting chapter introducing different types of models. So let's go through them one by one, okay, and get some very basic knowledge about different types of models. Conceptual models, they are often established in the first step in model development. Okay, they exist in narrative texts or boxes and arrows. No, they can form diagrams or drawings of the system. Here is an example. This is a conceptual model for remote sensing process, right? So here we can say we have symbols, for example, satellite A or sensor A, sensor B, another symbol for sun, and processing stations. We have buildings and pieces and target. This is a target we're interested in this remote sensing process. So this is a very typical diagram showing you the general process of remote sensing. And this process is divided into 6 steps. And we have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're representing different steps or different stages of remote sensing process. And several arrows are used to address the flow of information, Since this is not a remote sensing class, I'm not going to go to go into details of this figure, but you should know this figure, this drawing itself can be considered as a diagram. It can be used to address the very general process of a remote sensing system. So it's the picture itself is a conceptual model, And usually it is used, a conceptual model is usually used for system analysis, okay? Simplify a phenomenon by breaking it down in an orderly manner into more manageable elements. Let's get back to this example again. So this whole remote sensing system has been divided into small components. For example, sensor A is a component, right? Sensor B is another component. Processing station, another component. In this station, there are multiple pieces and other equipment. They are also components, right? Of course, the target here, for example, this house is a component. Sun is a component because sun is usually the energy source of a remote sensing system. Okay, using these components to form this model, to form this conceptual model, and use this model to do system analysis. Here is another example. You can see here on the left side we have the real world system, which is a forest system, right? And you can create different conceptual models for it depending on the specific demand. If you do not demand too much information about this forest, you can prefer abstraction, which means that you can create a very simple conceptual model. This forest has biomass. That's it. You can simply use one single variable, which is biomass, to address this complex system because you don't care about more details. We just want abstraction. But on the other end, if you pursue realism, you can divide this complex forest system into a lot of components. For example, species 1, 2, 3, until N. You can list all species in this forest. And within, among these species, they have complex relationships, right? If you randomly, say not randomly, pick 4 of them who interact with each other, you can create a small model, another small conceptual model to address the relationship among these 4 species. And repeatedly, you can do this multiple times to exhaust all the possibilities to create multiple, maybe hundreds of conceptual models to address the possible relationships among different species in this forest system. And if you combine all the small conceptual models together, you have a very complex conceptual model for this forest system. So why do we do this? No matter it's very simple or very complex, we want to address this system at different levels. This is the systems analysis process. This process is addressed by creating conceptual models. Okay. Here is just another example for conceptual model. So conceptual model, like I mentioned in the last slide, it's usually the first step of modeling process or your research process, but it's very important because it is the base of your building. It is the cornerstone of your building. If it is not correct, or it is, I mean, this conceptual model is poorly developed, other work based on this model will be incorrect or will be pretty hard or pretty difficult to carry out. You should know that, okay? It's the first step. It's usually the most important one, because if you have an incorrect model here, everything you do in future is actually based on this incorrect model, which is meaningless, right? Okay. So general elements of a system analysis model or conceptual model includes components, right? Distinct parts of the system, for example, different species in that forest, right? State variables, individual component, or whole system measures that describe the condition at a point in space or moment in time. For example, the surface temperature of a leaf in Celsius degree, it is a state variable for that forest, right? Processes, mechanisms by which the system change from one state to another to another state or, over time, and interactions, physical or virtual exchange among system components, right? For example, interaction between the atmosphere and a tree, right? Because there is exchange of oxygen and CO2 and other interactions among different species, right? So these elements, usually they can all be found in a systems analysis model, okay? And next, let's talk about physical models. A physical model is usually a smaller or larger physical copy of an object. It could be larger physical model of a small object. For example, you want to create a model that can be manipulated to address an atom. Obviously, an atom is not something you can say, use your eyes, right? The structure of an item, the shape of an item cannot be seen. So sometimes we create a larger copy of an item in front of our face, in front of our eyes, so we can look at it and manipulate it, right? And explore it. And there are also models, they are smaller physical model of a large object. For example, the solar system, right? Usually, it's not usually. It's impossible. It's impossible to create a model with the same size of the solar system, right? So sometimes we can use different materials to create a smaller model for the solar system for educational purposes, right? For educational purposes. And there are all other models, for example, architectural models like this. Usually, architects, they need to design and implement these models before they can actually create the building in the real world, right? And we have wind tunnels for aerodynamic experiments for aircrafts, right? Flume models, here is a flume model in sedimentary geology to address the phenomenon of sediments. I mean, the movement of sediments in river, in ocean, right? And laboratory animals. A lab rat is actually a model. If you want to test some medical theory or test a drug, you test them on lab rats, and a lab rat is considered a model. And we also have mathematical models. physical models, they can be seen, they can be touched, they can be used in real world, but mathematical models, they are usually formulas and the mathematical relationships. So they are here to answer two questions, or you need to be able to answer two types of questions after creating or during creating mathematical models. The first question is what? A description of a system using mathematical concepts and language, right? So a mathematical language is the tool you use to create mathematical models. For example, a function, right? Or a matrix. Why? Rules for manipulating model to generate predictions, okay? And yeah, there are also different subtypes for mathematical models, because mathematical model is a type of model. And under this type, there are several subtypes, okay? Linear versus nonlinear model, static versus dynamic, explicit versus implicit, discrete models versus continuous models, deterministic models, and stochastic models or random models. Okay, again, let's see some examples. Linear mathematical models versus nonlinear models. Okay, linear models, they are linear in the parameters which have to be estimated, and they are the simplest models in mathematical model. It means that the input and the output of the model, they are linearly correlated to each other. Their mathematical relationship is linear. For example, we have four, say, figures here, right? Four functions here. Each one is a straight line. It means that, for example, for this figure, obviously x and y, they have a positive linear relationship. As x increases from left to right, y also increases from bottom to top, right? So this is the linear relationship this linear mathematical model is trying to provide using this straight line, using this green straight line, right? So they are pretty easy to create. The relationship addressed by them is pretty straightforward, but that's the advantages. But the disadvantage is that in real world, not everything, in fact, most phenomena, they are just not this simple, right? Linear relationship is just not enough to address most relationships in our real world. So we have nonlinear models, right? So there is always nonlinearity in these models. So here we have orange curves. If you compare them to green curves, they are nonlinear, which means that the relationship between these two variables, x and y, they are not linear. Y does not increase linearly as x increases. Okay. Even in fairly simple systems, if there is nonlinearity, it is often associated with phenomena such as chaos and irreversibility. It means that the system is pretty hard, sometimes impossible to predict. So the advantage of nonlinear models is that they're closer to real-world phenomena. But the disadvantage is that sometimes they're just too complex to create, or even you can describe, partially describe a phenomenon. You cannot use it. You cannot use nonlinear relationship to predict the state of the system in future because of chaos or irreversibility. So since we're talking about chaos, right? Let's say an example. of chaos theory, or you can say a chaos phenomenon. So the chaos theory is a branch of mathematics focusing on the behavior of a dynamic system that is highly sensitive to initial conditions. Here is an example. It's called double-rowed pendulum. So here we have a pendulum with two rows, right? The first segment and the second segment. And the one end of this double-rowed pendulum is fixed at a specific location in space, right here. And when you push it, it will swing. And if we trace the other end of this double-rowed pendulum, we want to draw the trajectory of the other end of this double-rowed pendulum. If you want to do that, you're actually facing a chaos phenomenon, which means that this trajectory is nearly impossible to predict. You can trace it, but when you repeat this experiment, the result will be very different. It's pretty hard to predict. This is an example of chaos theory. And this trajectory is highly dependent on what? On the initial condition of the system. Okay, and it's pretty hard to predict. And let's just assume we don't have a double-rowed pendulum. We have a very simple pendulum with just one segment or single-rowed pendulum. Then the trajectory of the other end of the pendulum is pretty easy to predict. We made this system more complex by adding another rod into this system, and this is the result. Okay, which means that if you want to create a model to address the trajectory portrayed by this gray line in this GIF, that model will be extremely complex, almost impossible to create. Okay. This is a nonlinear model, right? If you want to use a model to address the trajectory here, you're going to use a nonlinear model. Okay, this is a first video clip for the first chapter of this course. Okay, thank you. I will see you in the next video.